It's time to finally wrap up our DC Universe original review series, which means for today's video, we're covering Titans. But before we get into that, I'm your host and your favorite member of the Teen Titans, Justin, otherwise known as IDontBeatGames, and I'm here to bring that nerd culture content right to your monitors. I have a love-hate relationship when it comes to Titans because on one hand, I thoroughly enjoy this show, while on the other hand, there's a few things that bring down the experience overall that might turn people away from the show. An example, you might be possibly thinking, is this about the Teen Titans that we knew growing up? In which case, yes, you would be correct. However, this version of Titans, it's a lot more dark, it's a lot more serious in tone, it's not as lighthearted and enjoyable as it was back in the day. And in case you haven't watched my previous video about the show Doom Patrol, Cyborg is actually on that show versus being on Titans. And to add to all of that, I have to say, the pacing of this show isn't that great. And a part of me gets it, right? They have to do their job of introducing us to every single main character, which is Robin, Hawk and Dove, Raven, Beast Boy, Starfire, and more, while also making it entertaining and interesting. Like, I'm willing to give the first season a pass because it's the first season and because of the fact I understand all of that. But that doesn't mean that the second season doesn't suffer from pacing issues too, because it does. In a way, I understand that season 1 and season 2 isn't a great benchmarker for understanding whether the pacing is good or not. However, it's hard to not think that the pacing is poor because of the fact that they actually use different episodes to explain a character's backstory. And in case you've never watched Titans, yes, they do this before progressing in the present time within the show. And yeah, as someone who watched the show weekly when the episodes were dropping, I have to say it did suck a little bit to sit through a backstory episode before we went back to the present time. And I only say this because of the fact that when they usually did this, it happened to be at a time where something super interesting was going on in the present time, and all I wanted to see was what was going to happen next. Despite these pacing issues, I understand that they have the choice of giving us these characters' backstories to give the characters more depth, or choosing not to do so. It's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Now, despite all of those fair criticisms, there are good things that we could talk about. It's a love and hate relationship for a reason, right? One of the easiest things to look past is the cinematography. The way they shot this show is legitimately beautiful, and I understand that it's easy to look past just because of the fact that the colors of this show happen to be darker in tone. And honestly, I have to say, it's one of the many things I appreciate about this show because it helps getting so invested into this world a lot easier. And when it comes to comic book shows, I know one of the biggest arguments or conversations that we have around them is the fact that whether or not the action scenes are good or not. And I'm happy to report the action scenes within Titans are good enough, and I have to say I enjoyed most of them. In fact, while we're talking about the action scenes within Titans, we need to be talking about the CGI that they use for both Starfire and Beast Boy. I'll be honest, as someone who grew up with Teen Titans, it was hard to not be worried when we first heard about the show and whether or not the CGI was gonna at least look good enough or at least look decent enough for us to not be overly critical of it. When it comes to Beast Boy, he actually has a limited amount of transformations in this show, and I don't know if that's because of the fact that they want to give him room to grow or because of the fact that there's budgetary cuts for a reason. However, I have to say, the CGI effects for Beast Boy, they're good enough. Going into this show, this was one of my biggest worries. I know that Beast Boy has a personality that shouldn't be hard to nail, and honestly, I like him as a character, but when it came to his transformations, it was hard to not be worried because of the fact that I knew it was going to be so CGI heavy. The CGI isn't nothing to brag about, to be honest, but it's good enough that it's just like, you know what, you're doing your job, it works, and that's all that matters. And since we're still talking about the CGI, let's talk about Starfire. In Titans, I have to say, Starfire is this badass character. She's super likable, she even has super funny moments, but more importantly, she is this character that's just an all-around tough person. Don't get me wrong, Starfire is a caring character. They do a great job at making her even have a sense of humor. But most importantly, when it comes down to the action scenes and it comes down to the CGI, she looks like an actual superhero. And honestly, I have to say, they did a great job at making her look like this superhero and making her look like she could take on literally anybody. She is not afraid. She will do what she has to do to get out of a situation. She's not willing to back down because she knows she has the right ability to fight these people. Speaking of someone who was afraid early on in the show and constantly fighting people, we have to talk about Raven. To give a long story short, and to keep this spoiler free as possible, Raven is essentially the glue that keeps everybody together in the sense of she's basically the main character of this show. Honestly, it's almost genuinely funny seeing Raven be the most cared for or liked character by the entire cast of Titans. But relating this back to the CGI and relating this back to the action sequences, I have to say, Raven has easily the most interesting abilities and they all genuinely look great. Watching Raven use her abilities is always interesting because not only do the CGI and the practical effects look great, but you also get to see growth in her character as she continuously uses her abilities. Now that we've covered those tie-ins, I think it's only right we have to talk about Robin. You know, despite the overall pacing issues of this show, one of my favorite things about Robin is the fact that he as a character is so flawed and is so set on his ways that he gets knocked down on his ass multiple times and they force him to grow and learn from his mistakes. Sure, the writing might not be perfect, but comparing season 1 Robin to the end of season 2 Robin, he is a much better leader and a much better person overall in season 2. And this type of growth matters, especially in comic book shows where it's easy to mess up and it's easy to get weaker seasons as the show goes on. But when it comes down to it, when we get to see tie-ins from season 1 to season 2, despite minor pacing issues, honestly, it's a good show. I'm not gonna sit here and lie and say that tie-ins is the best DC Universe original, because that wouldn't be true. Honestly, it's Harley Quinn and it still will be Harley Quinn after all of this. But when it comes down to it, I like tie-ins because of the fact that not only is it a different take from the original Teen Titans that I personally grew up with, but it's a fun action show and it's a fun superhero show. And I have to give credit where it's due. There's a lot of good supporting characters that are legitimately interesting within Titans. And honestly, the supporting cast of Titans is huge, and I could spend more time talking about Jason Todd or talking about Hawk and Dove, but there's not enough time for this current video. If you were to ask me overall, is Titans a good show, a great show, or a bad show, I would have to rate it as a good show. There's a lot to like about this show while also simultaneously being frustrated because of different things such as pacing, such as writing, such as maybe not wanting this backstory episode like I stated earlier in the video. But when it comes down to it, one of the biggest size of release you can have is the fact that it's not on the CW. And I don't want to sound like I hate the CW, because I don't. I'm being honest. I genuinely like some of their shows, even though they're all pretty much okay. But when it comes down to it, Titans would fit perfectly on that network because it's so darker in tone and so serious, and they could go in different directions if they really wanted to appeal to that audience. But man, I am so glad that this is going to end up living on HBO Max instead of the CW, considering that, you know, DC Universe ended up becoming a comic book only service recently. But it is what it is with that. So before I wrap up the video, I think it's only right that we actually mention some of the news that we got about the 3rd season from the DC fandom event. So long story short, Jason Todd is finally going to actually become Red Hood, which everybody has been waiting for since the 1st season. On top of this, we actually get to see Barbara Gordon joining the family, which is going to be a really cool addition to the show. And finally, we get to see one of my favorite villains from the Batman games, which is Scarecrow. So I'm interested to see how they use him, how they build that villain up, and more importantly, to see what they do for the effects and whatnot. Also, the last bit of news that they teased at the DC fandom event was that the show was going to get a little more optimistic, so we might see a less darker tone in the 3rd season. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Overall, Titans is a good show. It's worth the time investment and it's worth the watch. However, when it comes to ranking it from the DC Universe originals, it might be under Stargirl for me. Currently, my list stands at Harley Quinn, Doom Patrol, Stargirl, Titans, and then finally, Swamp Thing. And that just about does it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the shows, I hope you enjoyed this series, and more importantly, I hope you guys give these shows a chance. Now, if you don't mind me, I have a few movies to watch to do a review for, and more importantly, I have a few games I need to review, so I'll catch you guys next video. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit that thumbs up. If you really like this video, hit that sub button. And if you're feeling risky and want to talk about these shows with me, hit that comment right now. I'll respond. I don't bite, I promise. As always, keep it real with nothing but peace, love, and positivity. I'll see y'all next video.